Right, welcome everybody to this evening's book launch of Anabel, Loyd's new sort of proper biography of Arminius Vambéry. And Anabel has, this is her second biographical study, and she seems to have specialized now in very interesting people who are deeply flawed. Now, many of you may know her from some of her previous writings, and certainly the people who work in Rajasthan, of which there are many in the society, will have known of her earlier book on Bahawalpur, the princely state that ended up just across the international border in Pakistan. It was published about 5 years ago, I think, and was one of the first books in many, many years to pay any attention to the most interesting princely state, which ultimately vanished. But she has also written on picnics, if I remember. Writing about picnics. And she has been in the past a columnist for the Indian Express. Telegraph, sorry, the Indian Telegraph. And is a frequent traveler in South Asia, both in Pakistan and in India. So we look forward to hearing more about her latest offering. Thank you very much.
Evening, everybody. Thank you very much for coming. This talk is called The Many Lives of Arminius Vambéry in the Age of Empire, and in hopes that you may read the Dervish Bowl, is intended to give just a small level of introduction to the man and his lives, with a snapshot, a tour d'horizon perhaps, of the places where they were lived across that age of empire, many of which I'm sure will be familiar to this audience. On that basis, I'm afraid you're getting text and no pictures, apart from this as a backdrop. As you are Asia aficionados, I hope this introduction to Vambéry and the travels on which his fame was founded will easily conjure images in the mind's eye of the places he visited in his time, at least rather more interestingly than my contemporary tourist photographs of famous sites like the Registan Square in Samarkand. And of course there is Google, which also has some excellent historical images of traveling dervishes, if you can once get past the multitude of pictures of whirling Mevlevi performances. So, Arminius Vambéry. I realized when thinking about it that I have a weakness for the Where's Wally characters of history, the ones who get lost in the bigger picture, but who add color when you find them. Arminius Vambéry is one of those, hidden among the crowds on the roads and in the cities spread over the wide canvas of the empires of his time. He was born in 1832 into what Hobbes-born, if we're to continue with his definitions, called the age of revolution. And just a few years before the dawn of the Victorian age, until not very long ago, I had never heard of him, but he may well be a more familiar name to members of this august society, beside his better-known compatriots who've been members here, such as Sir Aurel Stein, and the remarkable father of Tibetology, Alexander Choma de Korosh, who became librarian of the society's parent, the Asiatic Society of Bengal. I first came across Arminius Vambéry in a museum vitrine in Uzbekistan as a sort of mannequin dressed up as a dervish, with a label saying something really useful, like Arminius Vambéry dressed as a dervish. And that might have been the end of it, had it not been for the marvelous book I had with me as a travel companion, called Central Asia Through Writer's Eyes, which unexpectedly quoted this unknown person. I very quickly discovered when I got home that the only person here who I knew who'd ever heard of Arminius Vambéry was, in fact, Barnaby Rogerson of Eland Books, the editor and publisher of that and many other marvelous travel books. A little more research revealed the mysterious Vambéry, both in and out of the dervish costume that was his most successful passport, to have been extremely famous here in the later part of the 19th century, when he became, astonishingly, a vociferous cheerleader for the British Empire and a player of sorts in the great game between Russia and Britain for influence in Central Asia. He shared his opinions freely in newspaper articles and books, mainly in English and German, occasionally Hungarian, filled halls for his talks, claimed Edward VII as a friend, haunted the grand London clubs, was acquainted with several well-known members of this society, if he didn't actually mention entering your doors, and was paid an annual pension, rather reluctantly, by the Foreign Office for a considerable number of years until his death. The problem for successive civil servants was that no one ever really knew what they were paying him for, but neither could anyone quite decide whose responsibility it was to stop. He had an extraordinary life. A Hungarian Jew born in extreme penury with no advantage of family, fortune, or formal education. He was an autodidact who became a phenomenal linguist, philologer, traveller, spy, friend or acquaintance of the great and good across 4 empires, and implacable enemy of a 5th, Russia. He was also the inspirer of Bram Stoker's Dracula, and in a 21st century where vampires lurk in the shadows of every screen, it seems surprising he isn't better known for that. These days, of course, the memories of the empire that were the backdrop to Arminius' life and Where's Wally immortality are almost taboo and far more redolent of evil than the undead. In the 19th century, there was no getting away from them. I mean empires, not vampires. Arminius was born in a small town in the Austrian Empire, St. Georgen, near what is now Bratislava in Slovakia. The story of the Jews in Hungary makes a long bookshelf. They were generally seen to be better treated than in neighboring countries, but they were nevertheless denied most of the rights of other citizens, even though, to quote Raphael Patai, who wrote a weighty tome called The Jews of Hungary, the community included a high percentage of men of great talent. And the age of revolution was a time of change as those talented people strategized to emerge from their perceived otherness. Many emigrated, particularly to America. Others converted to Christianity. And large numbers, like Arminius Vambéry, who'd begun life as Hermann Vamberger, Magyarized their names to identify themselves as patriotic Hungarians first, and Jewish merely in terms of a religious denomination. The early years of Arminius' life were a period of intense Magyar patriotism and nationalism in Hungary that encompassed the Jews in the lead up to revolution against the Austrian overlord in 1848, the year of revolutions. At that moment, Jewish emancipation seemed inevitable and imminent. But when riots broke out across the country, old enmities and envies brought new violence against the community, and Austria's putting down of the revolution in 1849 set emancipation back by nearly 20 years. All the same, many of those men of great talent had become assimilated in 19th century Budapest society, whatever their names or chosen religion. They were the people in due course who gave the young Arminius a leg up and set him on his way eastwards in the footsteps of other remarkable Hungarian linguists like Joma de Koros, to search for the roots of the Magyar language with which Hungarianness was seen to be synonymous and an important part of nationhood. Late in his life, the patriotism of Hungarian Jews may have played a part in Arminius dragging his feet with the Ottoman Sultan, who he knew well. in the early days of Theodor Herzl's quest for a Jewish homeland in Palestine. Many of the Zionist leaders indeed were Hungarian, but they also faced extremely strong opposition from the more nationalistic Hungarian Jews. Equally, by then, Arminius was a pretty bloody-minded old man, liable to be wayward and probably of no fixed religious belief himself. He might have converted to Islam at some point. Plenty of the Hungarians who were exiled to the Ottoman Empire after 1848 did. A baptism certificate also exists in his name. He may, in the end, still have thought of himself as Jewish, as the Zionists imagined. Whatever the actual case, he was buried at last in the Kerepesi Protestant cemetery in Budapest, among the greatest Hungarians, which might have salved his amour propre of a lifetime of perceived slights in his homeland, and would certainly have suited his vanity very well. But we are leaping ahead of our empires. Arminius' detestation of the Russian Empire dated from 1849, when the new young Austrian Emperor, Franz Joseph, requested help from his militaristic brother emperor, Nicholas I of Russia, to restore the imperial status quo as the Austrian Empire began to wobble. In 1849, it was a Russian army that crushed the revolution, and Hungary was placed under a brutal martial law, while revolutionary leaders like Lajos Kossuth fled into exile. Large numbers of those Turkey, where Arminius encountered them on his own arrival in the Ottoman Empire a few years later, at the beginning of his philological and personal journey. Constantinople in 1857, when he got there, must have been mind-blowing. Philip Mansell has described the Ottoman capital in this period as a city of marvels, a cosmopolitan melting pot where the Sultan Abdul-Mejid sat on his golden throne at the Sublime Porte in Topkapi Palace to receive the dignitaries of his empire, while his band played tunes from Donizetti's L'Elisir d'Amore. And on the kilometre-long bridge across the Golden Horn, the nationalities of the world jostled for space. One visitor wrote, "There is nothing like it in the whole world, from San Francisco to Peking. Nothing so alive, so vivid, so heterogeneous, so anomalous, and so fascinating." Turkey, mind you, was also in a state of ferment. Constantinople hummed with intrigue, and questions of reform echoed through the corridors of power and the drawing rooms of grand houses, while nationalist movements and demands for autonomy were stirring the air in many of the empire's satellite states. The Peace of Paris at the end of the Crimean War in 1856, only a year before Arminius arrived on the Bosphorus, in some ways signposted the beginning of the end for the Ottoman Empire, as it became increasingly indebted to European support and European creditors. In 1860, Turkey was referred to in print for the first time as the sick man of Europe, eventually to collapse during World War I. But for now, we should see Arminius Vambéry negotiating Turkish society, working in Turkish households, learning about Islam, honing his linguistic skills, and becoming so accepted in a city where class or creed were lesser barriers to greatness that he eventually breached the palace gates to teach French through a curtain to the sister of the teenage future Sultan Abdul Hamid. His long acquaintance with Abdul Hamid, he would have said friendship until they fell out in later years, was one of the reasons why the Foreign Office may have thought their payments to Arminius money well spent. The Ottoman Empire was possibly the place that suited him best, were it not for his itchy feet and yearning for what he described as the genuine Eastern life, as opposed to the gaudily painted curtain of the Eastern world that he generally enjoyed living behind in Constantinople. Like his fellow Hungarian exiles, he could easily have made his life there, and as he gazed at the great new palaces of this later golden age for the city, like the glittering Dolmabahce, and wondered at the luxuriousness of its life, he occasionally dreamed of a future as one of the powerful and multilingual dragomans to a European embassy. But the draw of the true East remained strong, and in 1862 he moved on to Tehran and into the Persian Empire. The genuine East, once he got there, did not entirely meet with his favour. It was dirty and uncomfortable, and as he was presently costumed as Istanbul Sunni Effendi, he was open to insult from the devout Shia population. The long reign of Nasir al-Din Shah Qajar had begun. You will probably all be familiar with painted and eventually photographic images of that later Qajar period, including the very distinct ladies of the court with their heavy monobrows and the surprisingly short skirts that were said to be influenced by Parisian fashions, actually the fashions of the Folies Bergère, observed by the Shah on one of his several European journeys. A recent book has described the Qajar Shahs as unique in the chronicles of Persia for presiding over a lifeless period of art, signaled by blousy floral decorations, mirrored bordello palaces, and self-aggrandizing royal portraits. It was also said that any person of talent could be sure of being employed by their court before being murdered as a threat to their grasping mediocrity. It was probably all exactly what Arminius thought the fabled East should be like. Whether or not he met the Shah at this stage of his life, Nasir al-Din was eventually one of the crowned heads he claimed for his collection. Beyond the Persians he met, it was here in Tehran, riders of the British Empire in the East, as he became acquainted with British diplomats in the city and began to understand the rivalry between Russia and Britain as they plotted to gain the largest slice in the anticipated forthcoming carve-up of the Persian Empire at the culmination of the hidden war of the Great Game. Persia had already lost a third of the old Safavid Empire to Russia when they annexed Georgia, Armenia, Dagestan, and Azerbaijan in the aftermath of two wars. Persia was also bankrupt and highly dependent on the British support, which was based less on the friendship that was pretended than on the fear of growing Russian power and land grabbing, which might easily threaten the British Empire in India. The Persian state, led by the Shah, became increasingly corrupt over the next 30 years. In 1890, it was said you could rely on the efficiency of just two institutions: the British-run Imperial Bank of Persia and the 600 cavalrymen of the Persian Cossack regiment under the command of Russian officers. Arminius got to know the British in Tehran well during a stay that was prolonged by a war between Afghanistan and Herat, making travel further east too dangerous. He did make a Persian tour and was pleased to spot Hungarian graffiti and to add his own efforts to the magnificent ruins of Persepolis before he returned to Tehran. There are varying opinions on the question of his possible enlistment as a spy for the British during this period, not least because the British head of mission in Tehran, the highly eccentric Charles Allison, with his jackal-hunting pack of greyhounds, who Arminius came to know well, was in absolute accord with him in his intense mistrust of Russian ambitions towards India. His warm relationship also with the Turkish envoy resulted in his acquisition of the best get-out-of-jail-free card available to anyone travelling into Turkestan, the passport of the Sublime Porte bearing the Sultan's signature, in effect the carte blanche of the Caliph of Islam. Arminius himself did not make much of this tugra. It detracted from the image of personal heroism that he cultivated, and pointed to the likelihood that he was also gathering information for the Turks. Finally, he set off on the journey to Turkestan, on which his later fame was mainly founded. He travelled as one of a group of dervish pilgrims to the shrines of Bukhara, by the Caspian Sea, where Russia still held sway. Or they did, and they had started to hold sway into lawless Turkestan, where the Turkoman tribes' main business was capturing Persians and anyone else they found, including Russians, to be ransomed if they were lucky, or more probably sold in the slave markets of Khiva and Bukhara. I will leave Arminius himself to describe the discomforts and perils of his journey across the Karakum Desert. There's a map at the front of the book until he reached Khiva. In the 1860s, the writing was already on the wall for the Khanates of Central Asia, Khiva, Kokand, and the Emirate of Bukhara. Regardless of the mysterious Oriental barbarity that played so well to Western audiences, Russia was already at the gates of their cities. We think of Khiva and Bukhara now as just cities, but they were states then, with borders that shrank or stretched as Turkoman raiders were repelled and one Khan fought another for extra slices of land. Khiva occupied a large oasis region centered on the delta of the Amu Darya, the Oxus, and encompassing much of modern Turkmenistan, parts of Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. It had a well-organized farming community in addition to the notorious slave markets, which were its most important source of revenue. It must be said that the Russians probably deserved Khiva when it was finally surrendered to them in 1873. They'd been trying to conquer it on and off since 1602 for the past 30 years with real intent, and they immediately abolished the slave trade. When Arminius was there, he was still able to describe the city of Khiva as one of the most dangerous in the world for a European to enter. The Khan, Sayyid Muhammad, was weak, sadistic, and fanatical, but he had considerable experience with Russians and had declared a term earlier. He'd also met various Britons who'd been engaged in great game efforts to gain influence wherever they could, although he'd absolutely no idea where or what England was. He understood the stakes, however, and was quite reasonably highly suspicious of spies of all sorts. It's likely that Arminius was untouchable under the caliph's insignia, but the daily display of stonings, hangings, and eye gougings decreed by the Khan for various religious and other infringements were hardly encouraging for a visitor pretending to be something he was not. Khiva, you probably all know this, had legendarily been founded by Noah's son Shem, who'd been wandering about in the vicinity, fell asleep, had a dream, dug a well with particularly good water, and hey presto, the desert caravans came and a city grew. Anything is always possible. Daniel of Lansden fame, as is well known, kept growing after death and has an 18-foot-long tomb in Samarkand, as well as several other tombs around Asia. And indeed, Mount Ararat, where is only one of the sites where until recently relics of Noah's Ark were to be found, its skeleton possibly still to be viewed at the bottom of a mountain lake. But the buildings Arminius saw in Khiva were those of a rebuilding of the city in the 18th century, when it was at its wealthiest as a trading and caravan centre on the Silk routes. When Frederick Burnaby arrived there in 1876 after the Russian conquest and defying a Russian decree against foreigners in Central Asia, he estimated a population of 35,000. The American journalist James McGann described entering the gates of the city with the triumphant Russians after the Khan had surrendered. Great heavy mud walls, high and battlemented with heavy round buttresses. Then inside the palace, a huge rambling structure, a new madrasa, and the famous Tower of Khiva, its surface covered with burnt tiles, brightly coloured in blue, green, purple, and brown on a pure white ground, arranged in a variety of broad stripes and figures, the whole producing a most brilliant and beautiful effect. He described much of what we can still see today, although it is hard to find the soul of what was in what is now another museum city. Burnaby was shown the hole where murderers had their throats cut, but when he met the current Khan, Sayyid Muhammad's successor, who'd been on the throne for 10 years, he was surprised after all he'd read in Russian papers about the cruelties perpetrated in Khiva to find him a cheery sort of fellow who had no more idea where England or India were than his predecessor. Arminius never got to the Khanate of Kokand, although I doubt that would have stopped him being an expert on the subject. These unknown regions where jinns might have roamed and magic carpets were quite ordinary, were grist to the mill of the born storyteller looking for embellishments. At the same time, his determination to be front and center of any heroic tale, which falls quite quickly today, whatever its effect on Victorian audiences, did not allow much space for other more fantastical fantasy. Generally, he couldn't wait to look at the world beyond his own idealized person and find it wanting, and he found a lot to complain about in the East he'd dreamed of for so much of his youth. His next stop was Bukhara, crossing the Oxus by ferry, and then following a route across the desert and running out of water on the way. Bukhara the Noble was the holiest city in Central Asia, and probably the most dangerous for a foreigner. Arminius was in what he described as the chief nest of Islamite fanaticism. Nowadays, several decades after the stark years of Soviet rule, Bukhara still echoes with its past in a way that neither Khiva nor Samarkand achieve, and retains its importance as a pilgrimage site. In the distant past, it had been a center of learning. Avicenna wrote his medical treatise there in the early 11th century CE, and it was home to one of the greatest libraries in the world around that period, before such fripperies were destroyed by the Mongols in the 12th century, along with most of the earliest city. 100 years later, silk routes, the marvelous old caravanserai are still there to prove it, albeit the Khanate has some very unpleasant rulers indeed. The Manghits who conquered Bukhara in the middle of the 18th century were astonishingly cruel. And to quote a member of a Russian trade mission in 1820, who managed to get into the city, perpetrated all the horrors and abominations of Sodom and Gomorrah, most of which he felt too constrained by shame to describe. The slave markets were full of women and children captured from around Orenburg in Russia. Alexander Burns, Scottish explorer, soldier, and diplomat, survived a visit to Bukhara in 1834 when the really fiendish Nasrullah Khan was on the throne. Luckily, he was out of town at the time, but the horrors of Bukhara were brought home most resoundingly to a British audience when Lieutenant Charles Stoddart and Captain Arthur Connolly were executed there in 1842, after years, in the case of Stoddart, in an awful dungeon swarming with vermin and biting insects. That story certainly lost nothing in the telling in the Victorian newspapers, and Arminius came next, not only to revive images of dreadful oubliettes and the Tower of Death, the Kalyan minaret where prisoners were hurled off the top, but to describe in great detail infection with guinea worm from the water all over the city and how to treat it. I must say, nearly 2 centuries later, and after Jimmy Carter's extraordinary efforts to eradicate that particularly nasty parasite, you can't help looking somewhat askance at the ornamental pools and fountains among the still glorious monuments of the city. Bukhara was duly absorbed into the Russian Empire in 1868. Nasrullah Khan's son, who was a less medieval emir by far, was allowed to keep his throne. Even so, Lord Curzon was told in 1888 that 3 miscreants had recently been thrown off the top of the minaret. But by that time, the Russians had built a railway from the Caspian to Samarkand, and we'd better hurry on there ourselves. Even today, when the recipes for the glazes on those miraculous azure tiles have been lost, restorations have been made with greater or lesser skill, and the depressing overlay of Soviet grey still pervades countryside and suburbia. It is still easy to get carried away by the magical myth of these astonishing cities. And here we are at Samarkand, the home of Tamerlane, the home of all the romance and poetry in the East. Inhabited for 40,000 years, embedded in a veritable Garden of Eden where man finds life easy and the climate is perfect, that, according to the explorer and traveller Douglas Carruthers, as late as 1949, Samarkand was part of the Bukharan Emirate, but has always had its own reputation. Timur's great tomb is here, and the aforementioned Registan Square, which most people have seen in pictures. But in 1841, a Russian visitor described the city in a sorry state, for the present generation do not erect anything new worthy of description, but are ever busy in destroying the monuments of former grandeur. Arminius behaved like a modern tourist there. He was about to turn for home and was, as it were, snap happy. This monument, tick, that tomb, tick too, and he saw the ruination which was at least slowed by the ingress of the Russian Empire and a dedicated bunch of archaeologists and restorers who struggled to save what they could over many decades from then on and right through the Soviet years. Arminius now looped round for a return journey via Herat in Afghanistan. Herat, Rumi's Pearl of Khorasan, had been part of the Persian Empire, and egged on by the Russians, who saw it as truly the gateway to India, the Persians had invaded again in 1837, when the British helped the Heratis to repel their forces, and yet again in 1856, leading to the Anglo-Persian War. In 1863, Herat was conquered by the famous Afghan Amir, Dost Muhammad Khan, just before he died, and it was his grandson, Yaqub Khan, a 16-year-old governor of Herat, who Arminius met in the war-damaged Charbagh Palace. Later in his life, after he abdicated the Afghan throne in 1879, Yaqub Khan told an English interlocutor in his exile in India that he'd known at once the dervish was a European. His military band had been playing. Arminius, indeed, wrote favourably on the fact that their officer had a genuine English accent, and the young governor had noticed a man beating time with his foot, which, he remarked, Asiatics are not in the habit of doing. British support for Herat led to what is considered one of the major historical architectural tragedies during the Afghan crisis of 1885, when the Russians made another serious attempt to invade Afghanistan via Herat. The British, helping their Afghan allies once again to repel the invaders they themselves feared most, flattened much of the great 15th century Musalla complex of tombs and religious buildings. Would it have survived until now? It was further damaged by earthquakes, and then the Soviet-Afghan War was almost its death knell. During their occupation, Russian troops had mines, delayed mines, run the remaining minarets to repel the Mujahideen. In 2020, to bring things more or less up to date, the Aga Khan Foundation agreed a major plan of restoration. The return of the Taliban a year later may have signaled its final collapse in the course of time. Arminius' return to the empire of his homeland was met by very little of the acclaim he craved, but armed with letters of recommendation, he made his way hotfoot to London and the cradle of the British Empire. He found he was in the right place at last. In his native Hungary, in his lifetime, he never achieved the fame he thought his due, and instead acquired in Imperial Britain. More recently, since Hungary shook off a different form of imperial yoke, things have changed as the country has rediscovered the intense sense of national identity that was always part of its natural makeup, for good or for ill. We see that nationalism personified by Viktor Orban, and Hungary has been hunting for lost heroes to decorate its sense of nationhood. After years of being almost as forgotten there as here, at least outside the doors of the Oriental Library of the Academy of Sciences in Budapest, Arminius Vambéry has lately been recognized as a great Hungarian. and had a large number of academic papers written about him, most of which have not chosen to notice any feat of play under the dervish cloak. On the contrary, they're very much disposed to portray their subject almost as the architect of British imperial policy in the East and the orchestrator of the machinations of the Great Game. Whatever part he did play, this is Vambéry in a guise which would have surprised the Foreign Office of his day considerably. All the same, he did manage to have a remarkable run on the British imperial stage among the lauded heroes of the times, and they were legion. He overcame the disadvantages of unheroic status, a severe limp from a childhood defect, and, one gets the impression, rather eccentric English, to be lionized by London society. Dressed in the dervish disguise he used during his travels through those terrifying khanate, he took his place against the backdrop of momentous events with those who were a far better fit with Victorian images of daring do. Captain Fred Burnaby, who we've already met and who wrote A Ride to Khiva, was 6'4" in his socks and made much more glamorous than he really was in that wonderful elongated portrait by Tissot. Then there was Sir Richard Burton, of course, and Speke, David Livingstone, suffering interestingly near the end of his life from the privations of his African explorations, and all those others who may have entered the doors of this society and who inspired writers like G.A. Henty to romanticize empire to another generation. The Victorians, of course, liked their heroes best of all when they were already deceased after a romantically painful death in some suitably distant and barbarous country, like Connolly in Stoddart, Alexander Burns in Kabul, and other players in the Great Game. After he died in 1913, Arminius Vambéry's name disappeared into the mayhem of World War I. Letters and reports were tucked away into the archives of the Royal Geographic Society, the Foreign Office, and the publishers John Murray, who'd first brought him to public notice in London with the publication of his Travels in Central Asia in 1964. Otherwise, occasional copies of his autobiographical works gather dust in the shelves of second-hand bookshops. During the terrible upheaval of 1914 to 18, the world and the empires where Arminius had led his many lives had been blown apart and either disappeared too, or were looking towards very different futures in the 20th century. In his brilliant book, The Great Game, published in 1990, shortly after the Russians had withdrawn again from Afghanistan, Peter Hopkirk wrote, "Not much has changed in the last 100 years. The Great Game has never really ceased." Since then, the theatres of war may have changed somewhat. Afghanistan, for now, out of the spotlight behind a dark curtain, is in a worse position than ever it was. I wonder, in the introduction to the Dervish Bowl, if Arminius Vambéry would today have substituted Sinophobia for Russophobia, given Chinese incursion into the countries of Central Asia and everywhere else they can find a toehold. That might have been the case when I was in Central Asia a few years ago, but now we seem beset by tyrants at every point of the compass. I wonder how he would have chosen his enemies. I can't help thinking Russia might be back at the top of the list for this week at least. On the other hand, as a flag-waving, cudgel-bearing British imperialist, Arminius Vambéry might have had greater difficulty finding friends. But then I would finish with an anecdote that came my way the other day when I introduced him to some members of the Travellers Club. A man who introduced himself as an investment banker said he'd recently had dinner at the Hungarian Academy of Sciences with Viktor Orban. The Prime Minister had come up to him and remarked, to his considerable surprise, "Of course, we have an umbilical cord with Britain. Arminius Vambéry." Arminius would have loved it.
Thank you for a really lovely and engaging talk, and what a colorful character. And I'm keen to read the book. Are you happy to take a few questions from the audience? Yeah.
I've been calculating about 60 years ago, I hitchhiked from my schoolboy from Belfast. Yep, the streets, and walked up Borgard Pass and the country. 10 years later, did a BBC radio and a series of programs about Irish. I've done never to Dracula. Central was Sarah Dunant, who later made it famous. We interviewed Christopher Frayne, who was then a very young academic. And we interviewed him outside the Lyceum Theatre, where he said the idea of Dracula came to him from after he was then the manager, and the work after the performance would be dinners backstage. And one of these dinners he met somebody, and that's where he heard about Dracula. Is this true?
Well, I believe it to be true, yes. And in fact, they met first at a sort of command performance at Windsor. And then they continued to meet in London, and they had various dinners. And I think that Arminius Vambéry then spun another tale or two about Hungarian folklore, which indeed he did write a book about. But absolutely, I think that is exactly what happened.
Thank you.
There's a chapter on Vambéry in Fitzroy Claims of Person.
Indeed.
And seem to remember he says that there was some skepticism behind whether Vambéry had actually been to all the places.
Absolutely.
Is there still doubt about that?
I think the general view, which I have subscribed to, is that he did go to those places, but he wasn't there very long. I mean, it was a pretty short trip, sort of thing. He certainly embroidered on his actual knowledge considerably. But then he did get to know a lot of people who probably knew more than he knew, and he had a very retentive mind, I think. And he did just manage to portray himself as this great expert based on not a huge amount, possibly.
Was he a family man? Did he marry?
He did. He did marry eventually. He was extraordinarily dismissive of his poor wife, who he never stopped telling everybody she was constantly ill, and actually she outlived him by a few years. And they had two sons. No, sorry, they had one son, and he then went on and had two sons. And their son, I think he was a fairly eccentric character too, but he became Hungarian ambassador in the US. But there were stories about him. There was a barking dog who lived in the house next door, so he fed it meatballs spiked with sleeping pills and things like that. So I think he was quite unusual. And his two sons, one of them died young, got some sort of fever, and the other one was a great music expert, and he died only about 15 years ago. So, and that was the last of
them. Some of these extraordinary characters, in some degree, changed the world, which Roberta speaks to mind.
Yes.
Was the world different when Vambéry died than it had been before he was born?
I think it was different, but not because of him. No, he would certainly claim credit. On that.
He was with his band of merchants going across Central Asia, and I remember reading that they suggested when he come along with Persia China as well. Thought about that. Decided not to. Had he done so, do you think his versatile talent
Oh, I should think so. I'm sure it would have been a good story, whatever actually happened. But I think the truth was, he didn't enjoy the traveling that much. He never stopped complaining. Everything was always wrong. And he did have this very lame leg. He was a small man with this terrible limb. And I think the fact that he got anywhere was fairly remarkable, actually. But a lot of it I don't think he enjoyed. And I think he had quite enough traveling. Staying in Europe was much more his taste.
Can I ask a quick question? You had mentioned at the beginning of your talk that he had started out with philological aspirations.
Yes.
And did he keep that up at all?
Yes. I mean, I think they reckon that he did speak 16 languages, wrote 12, and he claimed that he spoke, or he had knowledge of a vast number more, which I have no idea what the truth of that was. But his Chagatai dictionary, I believe that experts now say is complete rubbish. Yeah. Yeah.
Did this not present you any problems? Is there not a point with somebody's, you can see how chameleon-like it would be good.
Yes.
If you could cover up that.
Yeah.
Did it not present you any problems?
Apparently not. I think he just was whatever the person he was with wanted him to be. I mean, there were, as I say, the Zionists, I think, definitely believe that he really was a practicing Jew. And latterly in Turkey, they thought he must have converted to Islam because so many of the Hungarians had. And there is a baptism certificate, as I say. So God knows. I don't think he really believed in anything very much except himself. Exactly. Good.
I just have two or three. First of all, office.
Yeah.
Geopolitical places. In your mind, under which Russian?
Under the Turkish. I think he definitely, that Tugra, the Caliph's passport was hugely valuable. But as I say, he very much played that down because he just wanted it to be seen that he'd done it all on his whim. And he then wrote his travel and then a whole reams of other books as he added to the story. And yes, I mean, it was all about how clever he was, how heroic he was. That was the starting point. Then I went into old Foreign Office records next, and he was written about quite a lot, and the Royal Geographic Society. So, yeah.
Did he ever read travels?
His travels, yes. It's Samarkand, and then he went to Herat, and then he went back to Tehran. And he never went again.
Well, yeah, I mean,
yeah.
Other colleagues like
Exactly.
But it seems that if you read today, turn around,
well,
Russia, Turkey, and we see Great Britain.
Exactly.
You have your ambassador now very active. That part of the
yes.
world. That seems very interesting. I recently traveled. And I found it very interesting. Two things. They're not related. Prolonged invasion, and it seems that also the on Orient. I don't know whether we are going to come up with something new, or there may be some good old stories coming up to those. What is your take? Are we going to find something new in the coming years?
I don't know. We might find something, we might be fed something.
Yeah,
Whoever's in charge at the time is probably the case. I don't know, honestly. Whether I mean, there's always more to be found, you imagine, and hope, because it's sort of treasure trove, isn't it? But whether it's really that, I don't know. I have no idea.
Prior to acquiring his pension, where did he get his money from?
Well, he was supported by the Hungarian Academy of Science, and they gave him money in the first on the basis of this quest for the roots of the Hungarian language, and indeed where the Hungarian race may have come from, which was a big thing. Alexander Chomodus was same sort of idea, but then he ended up in the DAC and learned and got fascinated by Tibet, and then so he went off in a different direction.
Very awkward if you mentioned in the beginning that hometown Hungary or the Imperials.
Yeah, I mean, it's now Slovakia.
Those are the two most foremost countries now.
But he didn't like the Russians. And he loved us.
He was there.
Yeah.
Maddie, do we have any questions from Zoom?
Yes, can you hear me?
We can.
Yes, we have one from Ned Wantner, and he asks, when I was in Uzbekistan 2023 to 24, I asked about what people had learnt about Western visitors in schools, universities in Bukhara, Khiva, Samarkand. The basic sense was very little, but maybe something about Vambéry. Is Anabel's sense that Vambéry was picked over, e.g., Burns, Wolfe, Connolly, Stoddart, or others, because an Eastern Bloc visitor was more palatable to the Soviet education system?
The question part of that is, did I think that he was more palatable?
Yes, I believe that's the question.
Oh my goodness. Yes, I would think probably, because after all, he was a Hungarian. That's a bit closer to home than all these horrible British soldiers that were striding about all over the place as if they owned it. And he was he was a writer, was a thinker, a linguist, or whatever. Yes, I would have thought that he fitted much better than as it were, the Victorian hero. Yeah. But I don't know that. That's pure conjecture.
Any further questions? Well, let's thank Anabel for what a engaging discussion.